thank you, Jorge, for the introduction. Thank you. So I'm Ronan from Validato, and I think as Jorge just said, the webinar is going to be recorded. Please do, if you want to ask any questions, just type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There should be a little button, and we will answer those questions at the end of the session. If you could not write in the chat, that would be great, because today's session is being recorded and the chat messages are also part of that recording. So please do not use the chat, use the Q&A question and answers button. So today's webinar is all about a very exciting new market in the enterprise security space that Gartner has created or defined as continuous threat exposure management. I'll talk more about that in a moment, but we're going to cover about what is it, why is it important to you, what makes up a continuous threat exposure management program, how could you implement this in your company, and then we're going to split out a couple of the key components of that. And one of those is attack surface management. The other is around identifying likely threats to your company or your organization, and then how you test your cyber resilience on a regular basis against those threats. So let's start with just understanding a little bit more about what is cyber threat exposure management. So like quite a lot of things in the security and IT space, there's a lot of jargon and sometimes a lot of confusion. So let me make this really easy for you. Basically, it means know your enemy in a nutshell. It means understand what are the most likely or the most probable cyber threats that might affect your company or your organization in your country or your industry, and make sure you are best prepared to defend against those threats. In a nutshell, that's what this presentation today is all about. Trying to implement that is obviously a little bit more complex, which is what we're going to cover today. So if you want to see where Gartner puts this definition, this market definition, exposure management, I think they probably didn't have enough space to put cyber threat in here, but cyber threat exposure management is this very rapidly growing market that Gartner has defined. It's going to be about a $7 to $10 billion market within about 5 years' time. So very high value, high growth market. And today we're going to talk about a couple of the components that make up an exposure management or threat exposure management program. So on that point, cyber threat exposure management programs are, it's very rare, I would say, that there will be one vendor or one supplier that can provide all components to looking at how you assess and test and protect against threats. So the way Gartner has defined this is in 5 stages. So they've created a little circle or a wheel here with 5 core groupings. And so the first 2 are really all about how do we get a handle on our assets, our attack surface, all the things that either malicious outsiders or even malicious insiders could exploit and maybe compromise. So we're talking about things like digital footprints, we're talking about attack surface management, we're talking about identifying exploitable vulnerabilities. And then we're going to talk about how do we take that knowledge, and not just, by the way, for your company, but if you are part of a value chain where your key vendors and suppliers are key contributors to your business processes. So you maybe share data with them, or they're really critical to your business operations. So we want to make sure we're monitoring the attack surface and the cyber risk side of this, not just for your company, but anyone that helps you do what you do. So your vendors, your suppliers, your partners. But then we also want to understand what are the really important things to focus on, because what Gartner is really clearly saying now is that um, it's still very important to assess and scan for things like vulnerabilities. But what is becoming really overwhelming for IT and security teams is to constantly have a to-do list of 200 or 300 issues to try and resolve. And the next time you run a scan, you have another 200 or 300 issues. So we need to understand what are the priorities, what are the key things to focus on, and really know those really well. So we're going to talk about threat intelligence and how do we prioritize threat intelligence. And then we start to look at, okay, now we know what our attack surface looks like, we know what our risk posture looks like. We know what kind of vulnerabilities, internal and external, could be exploited by malicious actors. And then we want to understand what actors or what threats might exploit those vulnerabilities. So let's now look at how do we test our resilience? How do we become prepared and resilient against the likely threats? So we're going to start doing things like attack simulations, which is what we're going to show in the second part of this. And then the fifth component is really what Gartner calls mobilization. But really, this is about an acknowledgement that maybe security teams or even external service providers might provide some of this scanning, some of this monitoring, the prioritization. They might even provide some of the validation and the attack simulation, threat simulation type work. But at the end of the day, it's probably people who are responsible for infrastructure and IT who may need to be key stakeholders to implement some of the things that need to be fixed. So how do we make that really easy for IT or other stakeholders or even other members of the security team to implement high priority remediation fixes? That's what this is all about. Sounds easy. In practice, it's probably a little bit more complex. So to maybe just put this into some simple examples and context for you, all of these companies that you see on the screen, and these are all from literally from each continent. So Boeing from the Americas, ICBC Bank is a huge Chinese commercial bank. Allen and Overy is a global law firm, but headquartered in the UK. And DP World, I believe, might actually be a British company, but their Australian business unit was recently affected by the same thing that all of these others were. And that was within the last 4 weeks, all of those companies were subject to public disclosures of ransomware attack, particularly by the Lockbit ransomware threat actor. So that is obviously really bad. But Lockbit has been around for some time. So this is a really great example of how we can look at cyber threat exposure management and understand actually could those companies or any other company in the world maybe have foreseen this or have done a better job at maybe being more resilient to threats like Lockbit. So what I want to do now is to show you what this looks like in terms of a thing called MITRE ATT&CK. So we're going to talk about MITRE ATT&CK in a little moment, but MITRE ATT&CK is a knowledge base, a knowledge library, if you like, of adversarial and attacker techniques and methods. So it is the methods and the techniques that are used by Lockbit and so on. And actually on the screen here, we can see basically a kill chain view of how cyber attacks develop and then are executed. So there's some reconnaissance, for some resource development, they gain initial access, they execute their malware, they gain persistence. In most cases, they try and gain extra privilege, etc., etc. In the particular case of the 4 companies, but there were, by the way, many more than just 4, the Lockbit threat actor actually was trying to exploit a public-facing application. Okay, so that was the way that they got in. And in this particular example, although Lockbit has been around for some time and they have used phishing and they've used other remote services and they've tried to compromise user accounts by either through phishing or purchasing dark web credentials and so on. In this particular case, they found a load of companies that were very vulnerable to a thing called the Citrix Gateway bleed vulnerability. So this is a vulnerability that has been very publicly disclosed over the last 4 to 6 weeks. And I would say most people on today's call may have read something about this. And hopefully, if it's if that product is in your company, you may have already patched that vulnerability. But this is basically how Lockbit got into those companies. What, in our opinion, is, so it's really bad that they got in, but we don't want these type of attacks to be successful. So even if they get in, even if they exploit user accounts, either by purchasing credentials or through phishing, or they're manipulating a vulnerability, that should really be where the attack stops, because they should not be able to execute their malware, and they should not be able to gain persistence and gain higher levels of privilege and so on. So today's presentation is all about, is it possible, firstly, to understand what does a company look like from its outside view? So its attack surface and the assets that are publicly visible to external actors. And also, is there something you can do about becoming more resilient so that you can stop and block attacks at key phases of the attack? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I want my colleague Andrew to do a little segue into a tool called Black Kite, which is a cyber risk monitoring tool that assesses and monitors attack surfaces. And we're going to look very clearly at how does this tool enable you and your vendors and your supply chain to see what attackers can see, and to maybe prioritize some of the vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Andrew.
Thank you, Ronan. So when I talk about attack surface, what's important here is understanding what tools like a cyber risk rating or cyber risk assessment tool can do for you and how they're actually operating. In this case, I'm looking at a tool called Black Kite, but most of them operate in a similar manner. So it's understanding, how does this tool get and bring together your complete attack surface and show you what's going on. So I'm going to look down, and one of the areas is the digital footprint, and I'm going to go straight into the digital footprint over here. Now, I'm using example.com. Example.com is actually a real set of infrastructure that does exist on the internet that has been created for things like this. Now, as we can see over here, there are many domains that belong to example.com. So how did we collect these, or how does these tools collect this information? What they do is they do a who is search, and they look for any domains that have been registered using an @example.com email address. Now, this is when you need to be aware of limitations in this regard and what is best practice in your own scenario. If you want to make use of a tool like this to keep track of your many domains across all of your infrastructure, when you register your actual domain, you need to not redact the registration information. You need to make use of generic information that would be publicly available. So in this case, you can see that there are various email addresses that have been used. We would suggest you use one like dnsadmin@example.com to register all of your domains. Certain countries, however, like Switzerland and Sweden, prevent whois searches to be able to do this. So you need to be aware of that too. The other issue that you find that may occur is you end up with domains being added to your digital footprint that have been registered by someone in your organization that is for personal use because they have made use of their business email address. That is very easily addressed. by asking them to change that and change the registration email address and not use their business email address for such scenarios. So now what you've managed to do is build a complete picture of all of the domains registered to your company. From that, the automated tools should be able to go out and build a complete list of subdomains using open source intelligence and IP addresses and IP blocks related to your organization. You are now seeing exactly what a threat actor is seeing and how they are able to build a picture of your organization, but you've also got visibility at the same time. From this, what you're then able to do with these tools is understand the weaknesses that are visible in the public domain using open source intelligence. Now, this is going to vary from the information that you may get if you happen to be using a vulnerability management tool. It's important, though, that you have both sets of information, because the threat actor and the way you end up being exploited is because you end up on the threat actor's radar, using places like Shodan, ZoomEye, Census, and many other type sources. That's where they search for things like patch management vulnerability, open ports like RDP ports. And then if we look at items like this with example.com, we have things like a Confluence issue. So this company's been tagged because it's actually running Confluence. Now, while you're doing this, just as importantly as we're talking about your own infrastructure and patching, you also happen to have other organizations that are part of your ecosystem, and they could very well be making use of things like Citrix gateways, Sophos web appliances, and therefore if they happen to end up being compromised, that can lead to a compromise of your environment as well. So you need to take into account your whole ecosystem when you're looking at your attack surface. It's not just about you. Now, while you're busy doing that exercise, and I've given you some of the limitations and challenges around doing this, you want to be able to see, how susceptible are you to ransomware. But when looking at your ecosystem, and we look at an organization like Microsoft, Microsoft is this vast company. So what should we be looking at when we're doing that? Well, it's very useful if you have additional information available to you from something like Standard & Poor's, which now starts listing out, okay, what is all part of Microsoft, so that you can then look at the relevant parts. This works in two ways. It enables you to narrow your scope, but also ensure that you are not missing out on items that may not have automatically been, included in your compilation of the digital footprint. For example, GitHub is part of Microsoft, so you might want to look at GitHub, but Microsoft may not quite have got around to registering or changing or updating the domain registration related to these companies as well. Now, if they're all part of this infrastructure and they end up compromised, that can lead to a compromise of GitHub. So you need to make a decision. Are these part, or should they be in scope, or should they not be in scope? So you can look then to see whether you have got them included in scope or not in the scope of your environment. So the whole example here is to end up and make use of a tool that not only enables you to understand and look at your own organization and what it looks like publicly, but also anything in your ecosystem and everybody's very good at talking about fourth parties. That just increases the scope so much that what you want is a tool that's going to be able to bring to your attention fourth parties when it is relevant and whether you can see them or not. So that happens to be just a very brief overview of attack surface and the information you can see about it. There is a lot more that we can look at and drill down into, but that is beyond the scope of this webinar today. Ronan, I think it's back to you for you to carry on your side.
Super, Andrew. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's move on to the next part of that wheel that we showed at the beginning of the presentation. And we're going to move away from attack surface and identification of vulnerabilities or exploitable vulnerabilities. I'm going to move into threats and likely threats, and how do you prioritize or identify those threats? So this is in itself a very huge topic, and it's worthy of at least a separate webinar in its own. So I'm going to do a very great injustice by doing this in a couple of slides. Other than to say that there are many sources of cyber threat intelligence that your company can make use of. Surprisingly, a lot of threat intelligence can be acquired for free by organizations like your national certs and your government or regional European authorities like ENISA, for instance. So some sources of very, very valuable cyber threat intelligence would be CISA in the US or the Canadian counterparts, the NCSC in the UK, the ACSC in Australia, but also the Spanish, Portuguese, French national certs as well. There are also a range of cyber threat advisory service providers. So these would be analysts, your auditors, regulators, anyone who says, in this region, in this country, in this industry, these are known and identified threats that you need to be aware of. And then obviously there are services and there are technology platforms and tools that are out there that organizations can use to identify potential and active threats to their assets and their infrastructure. And a lot of those tool sets very much work alongside what Andrew just showed you with the identification of externally facing assets and infrastructure, because clearly that is the scope, if you like, of what a threat actor is likely to affect if they were to attack your organization. So it's really important to make sure the context is right, but there's a range of either free or commercial tools out there that can help you to either monitor threats or to create things like threat profiles. Tidal Cyber, for instance, is a great tool that enables you to understand, well, I'm in retail in Spain, and I'm this type of organization, so therefore these threats are the most likely known threats that would affect my type of business, for instance. And one of the things that we are huge supporters of at Validato is the US nonprofit organization called MITRE, but also their movement around this thing called threat-informed defense. So this is really an understanding that it is increasingly, I would say, impossible to defend against every single threat. Most organizations do not have the resources, the time, or indeed the money to do that. So it's becoming more and more obvious that organizations need to do that research. They need the right advice to understand what's the most likely known threats that could impact and affect your organization, or indeed your value and supply chains organizations. And once you know that, really understand those threats in lots of detail, and then test your resilience and your defenses on a very frequent basis against those threats. So we're not talking about annual penetration tests. We're talking about much more frequent, maybe monthly tests of the top 5 or the top 10 known threat scenarios for each organization. So to put this into some context for you, this is a little snapshot. It's literally in about 5 or 6 lines long from maybe an alert that was maybe 50 or 100 lines long from the US CISA organizations. This is the US Cyber Defense Authority, and they are really very proactive in issuing cyber threat advisories that map back to these things called MITRE attack techniques. So we looked at the example of Lockbit exploiting a publicly exploitable vulnerability with Citrix Gateway, and CISA issued an alert that says these are the MITRE techniques that this threat actor Lockbit is using. Please test your defenses against these methods and these techniques. And if there are gaps in the ability to detect or protect against exploitation of these techniques, do something about hardening your defenses and your infrastructure. So what we're going to do now is to go into the next phase of the presentation and actually show you how it is possible to take a threat advisory like that one from CISA with Lockbit and actually implement it in minutes within your organization to test your resilience. So that's what we're going to do right now. But just before I do that, we just need to define a couple of things. So in cyber defense and cyber operations, security operations, I should say, we have known the concept of IOCs, or indicators of compromise, for many years. And when we look at activity and log data from our controls and our environments, and we do things like threat hunting, we are looking for things like IP addresses or malware hashes or fraudulent domains or maybe fake mobile applications that are trying to trick or persuade our staff or our customers or our suppliers into sharing the login information or other sensitive data and information. But that data is in the past. It's historical data. What I'm going to show you here, when we're looking at cyber resilience testing, we very much respect things that have happened and activities like threat hunting, but we really want to look at this from a preventative perspective. So we're looking at things like indicators of attack rather than indicators of compromise. So these would be, is it possible to identify the methods that a threat actor that is most likely to affect your organization, is it possible to identify those techniques and methods and then test them in your environment and understand, would it be possible for, say, a Lockbit threat actor to be able to do what it does without being detected and without being stopped? And that is basically the example of what we showed you with those 4 or 5 companies earlier. The threat actor was able to gain initial access, but they were also then able to execute these techniques or use these techniques to be successful. So we want to make sure that, one, your cyber defense teams or your external service providers are able to see this activity, and two, we're able to prevent and stop it as early as possible. So to do this, we very much refer to this thing called MITRE attack. And many of you on today's call will be very familiar with MITRE attack, but I guess some of you may not be. So this is a very valuable resource of attacker behaviors documented in a nice sort of kill chain or life cycle framework. And we look at, as I mentioned earlier on, attacks in different phases or different tactical phases. So typically an attack will start on the left and then will progress to the right. But the great thing about looking at cyber defense from a technique perspective, the techniques are all of these things in little boxes down here. And that is, for instance, if you look at something like the exploitation of PowerShell, for instance, or somebody who is exploiting LSAS memory or RDP ports, like a ransomware threat actor would do. If you test those techniques and you find that you are not able to detect exploitation of the technique and stop them, but then you harden them so you do stop unauthorized access, you do it once and you do it forever. So unless you open up that port again, or that you allow PowerShell for unauthorized users again. But if you harden your defenses, you just need to fix the issue once, and you stop any threat actor that uses that technique or that method. And so when you look at this from a threat simulation perspective, and you overlay the lockbit methods and techniques on top of MITRE ATT&CK, we can start to see what does lockbit do across MITRE ATT&CK to be successful. And so we already saw that they they exploited publicly facing applications like Citrix Gateway, for instance, but they also make use of things like PowerShell and Windows Command Shell. They exploit valid accounts, so these are real user accounts that they've either taken over through phishing or they've gained access to that user account, and they're trying to gain privilege and move across the organization. So what we want to do is we want to test each of these techniques, and then we want to prevent that attack from being successful by saying we're going to disable Windows Command Shell, or we're going to disable PowerShell for unauthorized users. So if Lockbit is using those methods to gain and execute their malware, they now have to find another way. So in this graphic here, if you lock down this command and scripting interpreter technique category, the next option for them will be to use Windows management instrumentation, for example. And if you lock that down as well, you're going to become really quite resilient. And by the way, this is not us saying this. This is MITRE in the US, and it is CISA and other national certs. So I'm just going to very quickly stop sharing my screen for 1 second. I'm going to reshare, just because I have a very wide screen here. And I'm going to show you very quickly what this looks like in an attack simulation or threat simulation platform like Validato. So in our presentation today, we've shown that there were real-world examples of how a threat actor called Lockbit was able to gain initial access to a bunch of very high-profile organizations by exploiting a vulnerability in Citrix Gateway. And we showed you how tools like Black Kite or other attack surface monitoring tools can be used to give you early warning that those kind of vulnerabilities are out there, and that you could be compromised if they're not fixed and patched. But then also, once the threat actor gets in, in the cases that we showed you today, the threat actor was still successful. So I'm going to show you what we do in this platform called Validato here. So we're going to look at Lockbit as an example, which is the one we've been looking at. And if you remember from our example from the CISA threat advisory, CISA was basically saying, we urge you, these are the MITRE techniques that are being used by Lockbit, and these are the things that we want you to test your resilience against. So basically, Validato does this, and so we test each of these techniques relating to the threat scenario in literally 2 or 3 mouse clicks. So all I need to do is run that scenario, and I'm going to select an area of my organization to run this on. So I'm going to do it in this part of my business here, and that is it. And in about 30 minutes time, I will have the results of how resilient I am against that particular threat. So this is how you can begin to see how you can take real threat intelligence of known and likely threat actors that may affect your organization and test them without causing any damage, and understand, are we okay or are we not okay? And so, like all good TV cooking shows, I have one that I prepared earlier today. So in this example here, we're looking at Lockbit ransomware, and we can see that in terms of our protection, so this is how did our security controls perform against that threat? It says here that we are 68% protected, but 95% detected. So we saw most activities, but we may have some way to go to improve our protection. But the great thing is, when you look at this from a MITRE attack technique perspective, there are not 200 things to fix. There are literally only 10 or 15 areas to resolve. So we can see that green is good and red is bad. So it's not even that that Lockbit in this particular example would necessarily be successful. So if they wanted to exploit valid accounts, for instance, in my environment, what my console is telling me here is that it would be very unlikely that Lockbit would be able to do that, because we can detect and our protection is good around the exploitation of valid accounts. However, for things like Windows Command Shell and PowerShell and so on, we may have some issues. So basically, the way these tools work is you just turn the red areas to green, and then from that point forward, you can then start to report on and manage cyber resilience. So today is not really intended to be a day of going deep into threat simulations and remediations, other than to say that it is very easy to take a threat scenario and then map that into a simulation platform like Validato, for instance, and then to see within a very short period of time how resilient your organization would be. Okay, so let's move on a little bit, and I'm just going to wrap up by saying that although on today's call we have presented a couple of tools and services that are in the commercial realm that cost money to use, we want to be fair to you and to the community, because there are many tools out there that do not cost money that you can make use of to do exactly the same thing that we've shown you today. So if you want to look at things like attack surface and asset discovery, and understand what do you look like from the outside world, how would an attacker maybe view your infrastructure and your assets and your supply chain's assets, there are a bunch of tools like Shodan and Census and SSL Labs, but there are literally 200 to 300 other tools out there that you can use as well. Equally, what threats are relevant or important or high priority for my country, my region, my industry, my company even. You can talk to the local Portuguese and the local Spanish government cyber certs, so cyber defense authorities. You can also talk to ENISA, the European body that oversees cyber defense on a regional basis, but also the UK's NCSC and the US CISA. So although these are national government organizations, I very much personally see organizations like NCSC and CISA as being almost like worldwide resources, free resources of incredibly valuable threat intelligence. CISA have armies of threat analysts who dissect common and known threats, and they share that knowledge with us in the community. And there's some really, really great information that you can use. And then if you wanted to test these platforms, we've shown you my company's platform called Validato, but there is an open source platform called Caldera that you can use, that you can find in GitHub. It's very technical, which is a slight downside, but Caldera will do something similar to what we showed you today also. So it's possible to get a grip, understand what do your external assets and attack surface look like, what vulnerabilities do you have, which ones are high priority and could be exploited, what threat actors might exploit those vulnerabilities, how do we test the activities and the methods that are commonly used by those threat actors in your environment. That's what you use Caldera or indeed Validato for. So hopefully I've taken a very complex topic and hopefully simplified it for you. But let's just recap what Gartner is trying to say. So we've shown you how you can scope out what does your organization or your vendors' organizations look like in terms of the assets and the infrastructure that is available and visible from the outside world. What kind of vulnerable state are they in? What risks do they pose to you or to your vendors? And is it possible for threat actors to exploit those risks? And indeed, if it was, what type of threat actors would be exploiting those risks? So we've spoken a little bit about CTI and threat intelligence, and we looked a little bit at validating and testing those threats in your environment to understand your level of cyber resilience. And in our world, we measure resilience in terms of the ability to detect activities and to stop or protect the business from exploitation. The last bit I probably won't cover in today's presentation around mobilization is really about the workflows and the automations of how do you identify something that should be fixed. There's a problem with a vulnerability, or you've discovered that actually PowerShell you thought was locked down, but actually there's a group of users in one of your satellite offices that are still able to use PowerShell, and therefore Lockbit threat actor could exploit those users to use PowerShell to execute its malware. So we might need to engage the services of an external service provider or our internal IT and infrastructure teams. So how do we do that? Do we pick the phone up? Do we share information? All that kind of stuff. That's really what mobilization is all about. So I think probably I'll stop talking now, and there are a number of questions already in the Q&A box, and while I'm just asking these questions and hopefully answering for you or getting my colleagues to answer them for you as well, if anything pops up in your head, please do type your questions in that Q&A box, and we'll very happily try and answer them for you. So I have one on screen right now, which is, so do I understand correctly that you or AI, if there's a lot of data, helped predict the new method of an attack? So instead of mapping the MITRE after an attack, you can predict the method of attack beforehand. So actually, no, I don't know who asked that question, but actually what we're doing is a lot more simplistic. We're not trying to, we're not yet trying to predict adversarial behaviors. There's a lot of intelligence out there that very clever people have already done that already does that mapping already. So if you were to go to CISA.org after today's session, you will find that there's a threat advisory from about 8 p.m. UK time last night, where CISA issued a brand new threat advisory. It's actually to do with a vulnerability exploit, by the way. It's related to Russia and to state-sponsored actors who are very specifically using a development environment and vulnerabilities that they have managed to exploit. But what CISA have done is that they have mapped out in finite detail all of the activities, the methods, and the techniques that various threat actors are using to exploit that vulnerability in organizations like yourselves. And so what we do in our platform, for example, or in other platforms, is to take those techniques and run tests against the techniques that are associated with the threat scenario. So I'd love to tell you that there's lots of very clever AI involved here, but we are a brand new solution, but quite old school, if that makes sense. And I think we're a little bit proud to be old school at the moment, because we see great application of AI in our future, but we can very much automate what used to be a very complex process the way that we're doing it right now. I hope that answers that question. Next question is, what do you see as the future developments in CTEM, so cyber threat exposure management, and how should organizations prepare to adapt to these changes? That sounds like a question you should ask Gartner, by the way, and they'll charge you a fortune to answer it correctly. But I might give my little 2 cents. I might actually maybe ask my colleague Andrew also to expand on it. But I personally don't see that there is a single provider or vendor that should provide a full end-to-end CTEM based solution. And I don't say that lightly, because I think that it's quite possible to do that. I just think that if you try to do all of the 5 phases in one solution, 1 or 2 of those phases will become not as strong as they should be or could be. So our particular approach in Validato is to form technical alliances with world-class, best-in-class vendors in the categories that Validato doesn't work in. So for instance, we have a great alliance with Black Kite, for instance, and with some of the CTI providers, as well as the government national certs as well. I think probably some of the vendors will expand more into the other categories, but I personally, if I was a CISO in a mid-size or large enterprise organization, I think I would still like to see best in breed components around attack surface management and identification of vulnerabilities, and possibly even validating those controls in attack simulation platforms. Andrew, maybe you want to add 2 cents to that.
Thanks, Ronan. Yeah, so it's not just all about tools. I'm just going to take a very simple example. Let's take Office 365, which has mail. It might have data that you can access. And just looking at securing the access to Office 365 is vitally important. You don't need a tool to assess, okay, or look at that. You need to understand how your threat actor is gaining access to it. I'll give you a simple example. I come across companies on a daily basis that don't even have multi-factor authentication turned on for Office 365. Then taking it a step further, they sit there and they might have gone down the road of using an authenticator app, but when I ask them the question, have they enabled number matching and do they understand what number matching is on a Microsoft authenticator app, they don't know what that is. Very simply, your threat actor can use a very text-based phishing email and a rogue mobile application to harvest credentials and trick a user into multi-factor authentication fatigue, which is just acknowledging any request they get. So here we're not talking any tools, we're not talking out any outlay. It's about understanding the problem and the threats that are out there and how to sit and secure various aspects of your infrastructure against threat actors gaining access to it.
Thanks, Andrew. Stay where you are, because I think I'd like you to answer this next question as well, if that's okay. So the question is, how will the rise of technologies like IoT and 5G impact the strategies for continuous threat exposure management? It's a great question.
So if we look at it and we talk about things like IoT, I don't think we've seen the great rise of IoT right at this moment in time, at least not when we've been looking at incorporating it into attack surface, but maybe that's because we're not looking at those type of organizations. But it is most certainly a massive issue, and that's why automated tools become more and more important, because when we start talking about the rise of IoT devices that might form part of your organization or attack surface, they are probably going to be a lot more, or have a lot more vulnerabilities in them. And you're also then expanding your attack surface, like many more devices that happen to be out there. And the question is, how do you keep track of all of this that is part of the actual attack surface, especially if you walk into a new job, you're a new CISO. We know with the best wills and intentions in the world, using things like a GRC platform to track all your assets and trying to do it manually, it doesn't work. It really doesn't, because someone forgets to add something, forgets to delete something, and things get added by different departments, so you need to automate it. So the problem just becomes much greater with IoT and 5G. Still the same problem. It's how you keep track of the problem and automate the tracking of it.
Thank you, Andrew. And then last question for the moment, and these are great questions, by the way, so if you have any more, please keep them coming. So the question is, how frequently should threat intelligence be updated, and what sources do you recommend for the most timely and accurate information? So, do you know what? I think if we were answering this question probably a couple of years ago, the obvious answer would be the most timely threat intelligence is the most important information, and you should have real-time or near real-time feeds constantly feeding into your organization. And that probably is still relevant. But in the new era of looking at cyber defense from an adversarial and behavioral perspective, so look at the methods and the techniques of threat actors, it's becoming much more obvious that if you look at hardening defenses around key techniques, so in other words, ask yourself, is it possible for a particular adversarial technique to be executed without being detected or protected or stopped in your organization? And you change that around, yes, we can see it, and yes, we're going to block it. Then you can start to see, okay, what MITRE techniques are the most important to us? So which ones do threat actors use either most commonly, or which are, we call them crossover techniques? So which techniques are used by most threat actors that would have the highest impact? So if you fix one issue, could it stop tens or even hundreds of potential threat actors or their methods to attack you? And so I think our advice increasingly is going on that side. And I know that today we've shown you a specific example with Lockbit, and Lockbit is a particular flavor of ransomware. And last week we saw a new threat actor called Cactus ransomware, and we've seen Rissida ransomware, and these are all within the last 4 to 6 weeks. And if I was to answer that question 2 years ago, we probably would be saying, oh my gosh, make sure you are resilient against Rissida and Cactus and Lockbit. And today, I think what we would say to you is, let's look at the top 50 ransomware threat actors and understand what techniques they are using, which are the crossover and the higher priority MITRE techniques, and harden those first. So in other words, take a hop, skip, jump approach, a maturity adoption curve, if you like, approach to threats and cyber defense, and make sure your defenses are hardened around the obvious techniques first, and then become more and more sophisticated later. So to answer the second part of your question, the sources, I think probably the vendors like SOC Radar and Anomaly and a whole load of other threat intelligence vendors will say that they are probably the best source for those. But I have huge trust and faith in other services like CISA's Threat Speeds and NCSC, but there are other ones that are much more real time and transactional as well. So I provided some free ones in the presentation today, but happily offline provides some commercial options as well. So think actually we have one more question. I think we have just about enough time to answer it if everyone's still okay. And that is, considering that CISOs are now, this is a great question, be held liable or potentially be held liable for cyber risk and cyber threats, can Validato help CISOs avoid being legally liable for breaches? And in brackets, I'm thinking of Uber's former CISO and SolarWinds. Such a topical question, and I don't dare answer that. I'm going to get Andrew to answer that, if that's okay.
Thanks, Ronan. Really, when it comes to being held legally liable, the issue really gets down to, can you show that you did within your power everything to negate the risk? So it's really about creating an audit trail of what you've done, identifying risks, mitigating the risks, and a tool like Validato would be one of those that you could use that has provided evidence to say that you actually physically tested your, environment. An example of this and what we're talking about is, let's take something we might use every day, an escalator in a shopping mall or in a tube station. It will undergo a health and safety inspection on an annual basis and get a certificate of fitness. Validato is similar. It's about doing a test of fitness of your cybersecurity controls. So you turn around and say, well, I did test them this last month, okay, and everything appeared to be all in order. It's a piece of evidence to support your defense should someone be able to do that.
Thank you, Andrew. And just in the last 2 minutes, one more question came in, which is how does automation play a role in CTEM and what are the best practices? And so the person that asked that question, I don't have a lot of time to answer it in lots of detail, but it is central. And everything we've shown you today, even the manual bits, are using huge amounts of automation that even 2 or 3 years ago would have required quite significant human teams to manage. We are already automating a huge amount, but technologies like SOAR and workflow-based technologies, or technology that automates the processes and workflows of security, intelligence, and data, they're all central to this. And we see automation as a major driver to make CTEM successful. So thank you very much, everyone, for really great questions. If there's anything that you'd like to share with us privately, you want to contact us, you can do so at sales@validato.io. And otherwise, I'd just like to thank you very much for your time today. And I hope you found it as insightful as we did having you here. Thank you very much.